the over 1,000 pages that makes up the work, there is only one singular reference to any of the apostolic fathers. And for some reason, based on absolutely nothing to do with the immediate context, the quote that I'm about to mention here is a point of controversy that is often raised by Roman Catholics who attempt to use this quote to impugn the character of John Calvin. This is a quote that references Ignatius of Antioch, and it can be found in the 13th chapter of Book 1 of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. A chapter in which Calvin is arguing for the Trinitarian God, so none of us have any disagreements with this basic premise. Nonetheless, we can take a look at the quote here from chapter 13, paragraph 29, where John Calvin highly criticizes some writings that are supposedly attributed to Ignatius, as he states, with regard to what they pretend as to Ignatius, if they would have it to be of the least importance, let them prove that the apostles enacted laws concerning Lent and other corruptions. Nothing can be more nauseating than the absurdities which have been published under the name of Ignatius. Now, based on this language, if you knew nothing about the surrounding context, you would think that John Calvin has a very low view of Ignatius of Antioch. This is exactly what many Roman Catholics have latched onto, ignoring the further context of the passage, to suggest that John Calvin despised Ignatius of Antioch because Ignatius of Antioch was supposedly too Roman Catholic. It was too obviously proving the Roman Catholic Church over and against Calvin's supposedly Protestant innovations. However, I've already made an entire video on this topic debunking the claims of Roman Catholicism and showing, on the contrary, that John Calvin was not criticizing Ignatius himself, but rather he was criticizing false and spurious writings that were falsely attributed to Ignatius, but were not actually written by Ignatius himself. As I already stated, this quote comes from a chapter in which John Calvin is arguing for the Trinitarian God, and he criticizes these writings of Ignatius for teaching the opposite. Now, I suppose that the Roman Catholics who like to use this quote to criticize Calvin wouldn't want to side with these false writings of Ignatius over and against Trinitarian doctrine, but that is the logical conclusion of the context in which this quote is cited. And as I pointed out in that other video, in addition to this, Calvin also cites laws concerning Lent as an example of false non-apostolic doctrines that are taught by these spurious Ignatian epistles. And wouldn't you know it, when we examine both the true and the false letters of Ignatius, we find that only the false letters are commanding adherence to Lenten laws. Therefore, we can conclude from this passage, and similar ones, that John Calvin does not despise Ignatius of Antioch because he was supposedly too Roman Catholic. On the contrary, he holds Ignatius in very high regard. Nor is he condemning his true, genuinely accepted epistles. On the contrary, John Calvin criticizes those false epistles that are falsely attributed to Ignatius that are used to teach clearly non-apostolic doctrines. Because this is the sole citation of an apostolic father in all of Calvin's institutes, that means the remainder of this video will feature only quotes from Francis Turretin's institutes. And we'll stay here examining Ignatius of Antioch to see how Turretin uses Ignatius to further defend Reformed Catholicity. Turretin refers to Ignatius in regard to 4 specific points of doctrine. The first of which that we'll take a look at here relates to the Holy Trinity. Is the mystery of the Trinity a fundamental article of the faith? Of course, we as Protestants affirm that it is, over and against the Socinians and the Remonstrants. Turretin addresses this question in Topic 3, Question 24 of his Institutes. And in Article 21, we see the first reference to Ignatius of Antioch. He says the following: "With similar reason, Ignatius confirms the same mystery, that being the Trinity. We have, says Ignatius, one physician, Jesus Christ the Lord our God, from eternity the only begotten Son, but afterwards also man from the Virgin Mary. Nothing could be more explicit from this." However, you may have noticed that on the screen here, in the citation of this quote, Ignatius is not attributed as the author. Rather, it is pseudo-Ignatius who is attributed as the author. That is because this quotation does not derive from one of Ignatius's 7 genuine epistles. Rather, it derives from a longer recension of one of those genuine epistles. As I've stated in previous videos, those who are familiar with Ignatian scholarship knows that there are only 7 genuine letters of Ignatius of Antioch. but that each of these letters has a longer recension and a shorter recension. Now, virtually all scholars today agree that the shorter recensions of these letters are the genuine ones, and that the longer recensions contain additional language that had been added on throughout time that wasn't actually written by Ignatius himself. And in this case here, Turretin actually cites a portion from one of these longer recensions, specifically the longer recension of Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians. Now, Turretin here cites a forgery, but because he's advocating for the Trinity, it's obvious that he is doing so unintentionally. And this shouldn't scandalize us because, as we've said, there was great speculation and uncertainty over which manuscripts of Ignatius were actually genuine during the time period in which Francis Turretin was writing. And this was a debate that was taking place centuries before Turretin and wouldn't be resolved until centuries after Turretin. The general consensus of which Ignatian letters are genuine is an actually fairly recent development. And Turretin himself even testifies to this in passing in the very last sentence here on the screen, stating that Theodoret, a church father from the 5th century, also alludes to this specific passage of Ignatius, demonstrating that even during the time of the 5th century, and we can assume even before that, there was already forgeries of Ignatian epistles being circulated throughout the Christian world. Nevertheless, even though Turretin cites the longer recension of Ephesians to teach the divinity of Christ, the shorter and genuine recension also teaches the divinity of Christ. It just doesn't contain this longer language. So the principle is still the same, the citation is merely incorrect. And I contend that this whole situation actually proves that Protestants have no problem referring to Ignatius inherently speaking. We never have been, and we don't have any problem with it today, because we believe him to be a faithful saint who edified the body of Christ through his writings. The problem was never with Ignatius himself as a person or his particular beliefs, contrary to what Roman Catholics today might want you to believe, because nothing that he teaches inherently contradicts Protestant theology. The problem, rather, has always been in reference to which of his writings were actually genuine, which of them was actually authentic. We today now have a better understanding of which of these epistles are genuine, but during the time of Calvin and Turretin, this debate was still ongoing and obviously wasn't concluded. There were many false writings that have been perpetuated as early as the 5th century, like we saw, and was still continuing to be perpetuated in the centuries following, even during the time of the Reformation. Some forgeries of Ignatius, like the one that Calvin refers to in his Institutes, were obviously problematic, obviously taught false doctrines, and were easy to be discerned. But there are also other forgeries of Ignatius, like the ones that Turretin refers to, that do uphold the divinity of Christ and are pretty consistent with Orthodox doctrine, but are nonetheless still forgeries. The controversy has always centered around the authenticity of Ignatius's writings. It has never centered around Ignatius himself or what he specifically taught. Because as I've said, and as I've argued in previous videos, Ignatius does not teach a single thing in any of his genuine epistles that contradicts Protestant theology. In fact, if there were a contest to be weighed between the different traditions, the Protestant traditions have far more in agreement with Ignatius than the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox traditions. Therefore, as I've said many times throughout my channel's history, Protestants do not fear Ignatius of Antioch, and anyone who contends that they do demonstrates that they don't have a thorough understanding of Protestant theology. Turretin continues with his argument, stating that Ignatius calls Christ his God in the longer recension of his letter to the Romans, and that in the longer recension of his letter to the Magnesians, he says that Christ is the word of the Father, not projected, but essential. Turretin also refers to Ignatius of Antioch in regard to the Lord's Day, specifically in topic 11, question 14, whether the institution of the Lord's Day is divine or human, whether it is of necessary and perpetual or of free and mutable observance. The former we, as Reformed Protestants, affirm, and the latter we deny, as to both parts. That is to say that we, as Reformed Protestants, affirm that the institution of the Lord's Day is divine and that it is of necessary and perpetual observance. Turretin argues that an observance of the Lord's Day is favored by the authority of the fathers who were nearest to the age and times of the apostles, among whom is Ignatius of Antioch. Turretin cites two quotes from supposedly Ignatian epistles in support of his claim, and just as it was in the case of the previous topic, these quotes also are from longer recensions of Ignatius's actual epistles. They are not a part of the genuine canon of Ignatius. In fact, every citation of Ignatius in Turretin's Institutes are not a part of the genuine canon of Ignatius. Once again, this does not mean that Turretin is being intentionally dishonest, because after all, he's advocating for things like Trinitarian theology or the divine institution of the Lord's Day. Rather, he is just referring to texts in which it has not been determined whether or not they are genuinely authentic during his time period. Nevertheless, we'll still take a look at the citations that he does refer to, the first of which comes from the longer recension of the 9th chapter of Ignatius's letter to the Ephesians, in which he says that after the observance of the Sabbath, let every friend of Christ keep the Lord's Day as a festival, the resurrection day, the queen and chief of all the days of the week. Now, the genuine epistle does state that we ought to no longer keep the Sabbath, but live according to the Lord's Day, on which our life also arose through him and his death. This can be found in chapter 9, verse 1. But that quote that I just read does not contain the explicit language of exhortation to keep the Lord's Day or further descriptions of the Lord's Day that we see here in the longer recension. The second citation is from the longer recension of the 9th chapter to the Trallians, in which Pseudo-Ignatius says that at the dawning of the Lord's Day, he, Christ, arose from the dead. Therefore, the Lord's Day contains the resurrection. Unlike, however, the previous citation to the letter to the Magnesians, the genuine epistle to the Trallians here does not make any mention of the Lord's Day, contrary to what we see in the longer recension. Turretin again refers to Ignatius in regard to the lawful ministry of baptism. Is baptism by laymen or women lawful in any case? Turretin argues against the Romanists that these baptisms are not lawful, and he addresses this in topic 19, question 14. As it relates to baptism performed by laymen, that is, anybody in the church who is not an ordained minister, Turretin acknowledges that as it relates to the general consensus of the early church, there is no decisive evidence one way or another. For although it is not to be denied that many allowed it, it is certain that others did not approve of it. One of the figures that did not approve of it, at least as it relates to the letters that are supposedly attributed to him, is Ignatius of Antioch. He is so adverse to the administration of baptism by laymen that he does not allow even deacons to baptize. This specifically is a quotation from Ignatius's supposed letter to Hero, chapter 3, verse 2. Now, this letter, everybody agrees, is an obvious forgery of Ignatius. It does not actually come from Ignatius. Ignatius himself never wrote this. Nonetheless, it's still fascinating to read just to see the insight of what various documents through church history have had to say. Hero, if he existed at all, was supposedly a deacon in the church of Antioch, the church in which Ignatius of Antioch was a bishop. And in chapter 3 of this forged letter to Hero, Pseudo-Ignatius, writing to a deacon, tells the deacon to do nothing without the bishops. As it relates to baptism, the author says that bishops baptize, but you, Hero, specifically a deacon, are to minister to them who baptize, indicating that deacons are not to baptize. The final reference to Ignatius of Antioch in Turretin's Institutes comes from topic 19, question 24, regarding the breaking of bread. Is the rite of breaking bread necessary in the administration of the supper? We as Reformed Protestants affirm. Turretin states, it can be readily shown that the rite of breaking was constantly retained from the apostolic age even up to the 12th century, as appears from the monuments of the ancients, which everywhere mention this rite. Turretin then cites Ignatius, or in reality, Pseudo-Ignatius, as this comes from the longer recension of his letter to the Philadelphians. The flesh of the Lord Jesus is one, his blood is one, which was poured out for us. One also, the bread broken for all. And even though this is part of the longer recension, I'd still like to point out that there is here an affirmation of the substance of bread remaining present in the act of breaking, language that supports the Protestant understanding of the Lord's Supper and rejecting the future articulation of the doctrine of transubstantiation. But of course, that's a topic for another time. And I've actually already addressed that in a previous video for those of you who may be interested.